Hello, dear Marcus. Thank you for taking the time to interview to the Foundation to Battle Injustice. And please tell our viewers and readers about who you are and what you do.
Okay, greetings, Mira. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really my pleasure. So I am a British citizen who was born and bred in South London, actually in leafy suburbia. I found from earliest childhood I was fascinated by Russia. There doesn't seem to be any particular rational reason for this, but as soon as I knew such a country existed, of course, at that time when I was a small child, it was under the name of the Soviet Union, but this didn't change anything. So all my life I've been fascinated by Russia. I had the chance to visit the Soviet Union actually 4 times. 3 times it was in the mid 1980s, and there was still it was still really, communism. There was no, and also I was meeting people. I was not just a kind of tourist. I actually had some contacts in London who sent me to meet some of their friends and so on and so forth. So I got really behind the Iron Curtain. Life went another way. So I ended up living in France for most of the 90s, and then Czech Republic, and then finally moved to Russia 19 years ago. So I've been living in Russia more or less almost full time, with one quite long break, since 2003. My main activity in life actually is music. I'm a musician, drummer, percussionist, composer. I've been very active in politics for 2 periods. When I was young in Great Britain, it seemed to me that the country was going to fall into kind of Marxist revolutionary forces and so on. And I didn't like that idea at the time at all. I still don't actually. So I became a vigorous supporter of Margaret Thatcher and actually worked as a volunteer for her at election times and so on. Then, family started, moved to France, had small children, and politics just left me. I was very busy with music and with small children and so on and so forth. I didn't really think about politics very much. I still enjoyed history, so there I was living in France. Then Czech Republic. In Czech Republic, I began to be surrounded by people from the ex-Soviet Union, Russian people, Belarusian people, and many Ukrainian people. Many Ukrainian people of different sorts, except from Donbass. In those circles in Prague, I don't remember people from Donbass, but definitely there were lots of people, including Western Ukrainians, and including some of whom were already on the path of this Ukrainian nationalism and anti-Russian propaganda, I would say. 1 or 2 of them were very open and honest about it, even proud of it. Others were much more tricky, and they understood I'm interested in the Russian world, and what I was even already started learning Russian at that time. And they kind of, tricked me into going to some events and so on, and I didn't understand really what it was all about, because, I didn't know the proper history of Ukraine, Russia, and so on and so forth at that time. So that's basically who I am. And then I decided that Czech Republic is just too small. I had the chance to move to Russia, and I found work here as a teacher of English as a foreign language, and started making my musical projects here and so on and so forth. So by the time Maidan happened, which for me was my wake-up call. For some people, it was Yugoslavia. For some people, it was Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction and this horrible war. We killed 1 million people in Iraq and so on. Unfortunately, I got nervous, but I didn't wake up. But when I saw what happened with Maidan, and I saw the response of Western governments, especially to the reunification of Crimea with Russia, I understood that the world I was living in, I thought I was living in, doesn't exist. That it's absolutely clear that Western leaders had some other agenda completely different from the one they're actually telling the public about. Because, as I've just explained, I knew this problem from the inside. I'd already been around Russian people for something like 30 years, and Ukrainian people, even in France. I was friends with this group, so we used to play on the same festivals and this friend, and then they went back to Ukraine. I remained friends with them until 2014. Then we fell out, because at this point it became clear to me that my conscience could only take me in one direction. and that was in support of the people of Donbass and not supporting this Western putsch. And then I began studying. So politics really came back into my life. I say politics, it no longer means party politics. I had time on my hands because, unfortunately, as much as I love Russia, there are some problems here, and I fell into some bureaucratic problems with new reforms and could no longer renew my working visa for the next year. So I started living here on short-term visas, and I had more time. I spent more time in France. So I just started studying what really is going on in this world, and why were Western leaders, especially America and Great Britain and the heads of the EU, so deeply bitter and upset about the fact that Crimea voted to rejoin the Russian Federation. You know, I always knew that Crimea was a totally Russian area, and that they had referendums in 1991, and they had constantly been asking the Russian government, can't you do something? I remember very distinctly, it must have been 2006, 2007, Vladimir Putin saying on live TV on his annual phone, we can't just go around changing international borders. Unfortunately, Sevastopol is in Ukraine, and we can't change that now. So, of course, with the putsch in 2014, then we moved into another phase of history. And thank God, the operation went brilliantly, and the people of Crimea spoke unanimously to all intents and purposes. We know there's 5 to 7% people against it. That's almost unheard of in world affairs.
Do you follow the progress of the special military operation?
Yes.
And do you think everything is going according to plan, or what other goals have to be fulfilled?
Okay, I'm not a military person, I must say this. I've never been in the British Army or any other army. I have no military training. Of course, over the last 6 months, this military operation is of vital importance to the whole world. So I studied, I listened to people who are military experts and so on and so forth. So they point out that when you launch a campaign like this, there isn't a plan, because there are contingencies. If this happens, we do this. If this happens, we do this. It seems, many people are saying that intelligence had foretold that maybe Ukrainians wouldn't resist very strongly and might even switch sides and so on. So that was one plan. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. You know, whichever way we look at it, Ukrainians have resisted very vigorously this Russian special military operation. So they went to plan B, and there's also plan C and plan D, and all of these can work together. In an operation like this, there isn't one plan. There's a contingency depending on what happens. If NATO gets actively involved, it is actively involved, but kind of officially, openly involved full time, then there'll be another plan. And Russians have obviously made contingency plans for all of this. As regards the full goal, well, I think we know one thing about Vladimir Putin. He uses language very accurately. He said the goals of this operation are to protect once and for all the people of Donbass, to denazify and neutralize Ukraine. Not part of Ukraine or some area or Donbass, he said Ukraine. Now, that means all of it, as far as I can see. How that will happen exactly is anybody's guess, especially talking about the Western territories and so on and so forth. But I think we have to take that as the stated goal, because Vladimir Putin doesn't use words lightly, and he uses them very accurately. Even years ago, you know, all my students for English, I was asking them who has a good level of Russian in public. They all said Vladimir Putin, even people who didn't like his politics. And they said he uses the language very effectively, very accurately, and we always know exactly what he's talking about to the greatest detail. So that is the goal. You know, he stated it, and I don't really understand why not only Western, but sometimes also Russian people are kind of wondering what's the plan. As far as I can see, he said it black and white, and that is going to happen, hopefully, because that's what we need.
Yeah. Back in 2015, you wrote the NATO and its expansion to the east would sooner or later lead to a conflict with Russia. Do you think the conflict in Ukraine is just a pretext for the countries of the Northern Atlantic Alliance to start the long-awaited battle with Russia?
Yes, of course. Ukraine is an artificial state, actually. It's kind of unique in history. Its one purpose is to use as a weapon to attack Russia, and their stated purpose is to dismember Russia into various small republics, all of which will be controlled, of course, by the Western ruling elites and by those of the United States as number one, obviously. This was always the plan, so yes.
You also wrote that trying to cut Ukraine off from Russia is utterly insane because those countries were connected not only economically, but also culturally and historically. Please explain what has happened over the years.
Okay, well, let me say, first of all, at that time, when that was my first big article about this whole issue, and I was still somewhat naive. Of course, it is absolutely insane for normal people like you and me who want cooperation and peace on Earth and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people on this planet who are running it in the Western world who do not want peace, love, and tranquility. They want war, death, and destruction. And for them, it's not insane at all. As far as Ukraine itself is concerned, yes, the majority of Ukrainians are the same people as Russians, same culture, same history, same. Kiev Rus is the foundation of Russia, not Ukraine. Ukraine as a word didn't exist in that time. However, Galicians were imported into modern day Ukraine, and it is primarily these people who had this nationalistic, white supremacist, we are a kind of master race attitude, and they have polluted the rest of Ukraine with this attitude. And the number one enemy for them is Russians, because they are a kind of alter ego to Russia. It's really a very unique idea. When I was young and naive, I even told students in the 2000s, Ukraine and Russia, it's like Ireland and England. I was completely wrong. No, it's not. The Irish are a different people. They are really completely different to the English. If you're Chinese, they might not seem so different. But if you're English, and I'm part Irish too, it's really, it's not that. This is something far more, it's created. The inspiration came from Otto von Bismarck. Then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was of course a rival power to the Russian Empire, they furthered and encouraged this Galician Ukrainian nationalism. And apparently they created the Ukrainian language out of various Slavonic languages and dialects that were spoken in the areas of Western Ukraine and in this Carpathian regions and so on. I still remember a little bit of Czech, and very often in Ukrainian, when it's not Russian, it sounds like Czech. Novi Rok and Jakuum and all this kind of stuff. It's straight from Czech or Slovak land. I only learned the other day, as we know, Ukraina in Russian means on the edge or the peripheries of something. Apparently, these professors of language in end of the 19th century, Austro-Hungarian Empire, they made the same word in the Ukrainian language mean state. Kanin, P3, or what? So these people have a kind of mindset that they are the new Russians, and their dream is to become the new Russia and go all the way to Vladivostok and Kamchatka, and this will be Ukraine. And they have a fake version of their history, some ancient Ukraine that used to exist in the 11th or 12th century. Yevchenko, I think, this anti-Russian president who was there between 2004 2010, believes this. You know, he was telling about this on various interviews and so. For me, it's a little bit like these old Hollywood movies. You know, they say in Hollywood movies they actually tell us the truth. You know, the real elites are telling us what's going to happen. These films, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Now, I've seen completely normal people over 20 years, residents of Kiev who I knew, who were lovely people, who were saying things in 2001 when I was there with them. Oh, I wish I'd lived in the Russian Empire. It must have been such a good time, better than the Soviet Union because my husband was repressed and so on and so forth. Now that same person became a kind of anti-Putin, anti-Russian fanatic. Yeah? Now living in Paris, doing everything she can to. And I've seen this. That was the most extreme example, but I've seen over these 20 years people I knew, Ukrainians, turn into, not all of them, by no means all of them, but a lot. And it's really like a kind of mass psychosis. It's a mental illness somehow, but it's controlled and manipulated by those who know how to do this. And they've been doing it to us for millennia, actually.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you about. In your opinion, is it possible to say that the Ukrainian conflict was entirely directed by Western countries? Mm-hmm. And are ordinary Ukrainians aware of the fact that they have become a weapon in the hands of the collective West?
It is absolutely created by the West. As I said, this is really a fake state for one purpose, to attack Russia with. Do some ordinary Ukrainians know this, even from the West? Of course, some do, but the majority seem not to, really. Obviously, those from Donbass in the east, those who split off, and even if they couldn't split off, who in their mind were not with the Putin Kiev, they understand it. One does have to say that the entire Russian world has been seduced by the West since the time of Peter the Great. And I use the word seduced very carefully because the West is very seductive. In actual fact, even hundreds of years ago, living standards of ordinary people in these great countries of Western Europe were not, contrary to popular belief, higher than people living in the Russian Empire. It was Peter the Great who went to the West and allowed this Western influence to become, which is why the West calls him great. Ivan is the terrible. It's not even the correct translation of Grozny. When I first came to Russia, I talked about Ivan Strashny, because it said in my learning Russian book, well, terrible is Strashny. No, so everybody laughed. So, of course, this seduction by the West increased during the later years of communism, when although the Soviet Union actually in those years had a lot to offer the world, at a huge cultural level, very high scientific levels also. You know, the West glittered. The West had all these nice objects and pop music and so on. Real pop music, unlike today, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that the Soviet people didn't have. So all Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Moldovans, Kazakhs, Uzbeks have this kind of idea. I still meet people working here from Turkmenistan who are dreaming of going to Great Britain. So, well, actually, it's really better life for most ordinary people now than in Great Britain today. And they say, no, it can't be. Look how much money they earn in Great Britain. Yeah, but look how much they have to spend of this money just to live in. And so it goes on. So this Ukrainian seduction towards the West and all those people who in 2004 and again in 2014 said, yeah, the EU will save us and great Uncle America, Uncle Sam is the glittering. Many Russians felt this. In 2004, many Russians felt like this too. We saw when, thank God, this very serious attempt to overthrow the government of Belarus 2 years ago didn't work. But still, a lot of young Belarusians were also cheering for the West, wanted to be part of the EU and to leave Russia behind. It's very, very seductive. And also this Ukrainian leaning towards the West is understandable, actually, in the context of the Russian world, because at that time, still many Russians were leaning. Now, finally, I think the bubble is bursting, at least here in Russia. More and more people are waking up, and especially as we see now the crisis with prices of fuel and so on in Western countries.
Yeah. Where, in your opinion, did nationalists' idea get their spread in Ukraine? Why is the country that lost millions of its citizens during the Second World War inspired by radical ideas?
Okay, to go a little bit deeper, if I can try to do it quickly, this idea It's something Russians don't have. It's the idea that they are somehow superior and have the right to tell the rest of the world. Yeah, of course, ordinary Russian people can be arrogant. They can be rude, they can be unfriendly, they can be violent, or, there's all sorts of people living here. But in the national consciousness, this doesn't exist. The Russian Empire is actually the polar opposite of the Western empires of Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, who oppressed people, enslaved them, forced them to follow their version of Christianity, and so on and so forth. Russia never did this. Unfortunately, I haven't traveled so much in Russia, but I've been, for example, to Tuva. And there in Tuva, 80% of the people are Tuvan people, Asian people with a Turkic language living on the borders of Mongolia. Their culture and their language is alive and thriving. And they were not, and all these people, there were some battles between tribes when Russia was spreading east throughout centuries. Russia never forced these people at the point of a gun or a sword to become Orthodox Christians or to change from Islam or from shamanism or Buddhism or whatever. The Western empires always did. And it seems to me...
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. It seems to me we can trace this back all the way to the Great Schism of 1054. This was when the West went wrong. And when the Pope of Rome broke away from the other four sees of the Church of Christ and declared himself the ruler of all Christianity and infallible, and started a campaign of conquest, rape, and pillage, basically. First stop, England. Just 12 years later, in 1066, the Pope organized and financed William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, William de Normandy, and financed his invasion of England. And the last Orthodox king, the peoples of the British Isles had been Christian for 6 centuries. Certainly in England, the first Christians arrived in the 4th century. They were, of course, Orthodox Christians because there was only Orthodoxy at that time. The Great Schism of 1054 was the first breakaway church that began to change certain aspects of the scripture and the way services are conducted and the way communion is conducted and so on and so forth. And at this point, it seems, this is when Europe began to believe that it had the right to go to other parts of the world, conquer them, and force its opinions, its way of life on everybody else. And this is still going on today. And even when, so this is kind of white supremacy. And these Galician Ukrainians got this idea in their head from exactly how, I don't know, but I suspect it was kind of indoctrinated in them by these teachings from Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germanic peoples and so on. The Teutons, were always coming to the east and trying to... in fact, all I read about Russian history, even ordinary merchants in like the 15th, 16th century that came to Moscow and were doing business because it was already a big thriving place, and they were always trying to subvert the religion, to subvert Orthodox Christianity into either Catholicism, or as time went on, then the Northern Europeans became Protestants of various kinds, Lutherans or other kinds of Protestants, and so on. We're looking at a war of religion, but unfortunately, the rulers are neither Catholic or Protestant, actually. The vast majority of them have what Ronald Bernard, who was one of the escapees from this war, called an unorthodox religion, which is the very polar opposite of Christianity. So we're not really allowed to talk about this in public, actually, but you get what I mean, I think.
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
How do you assess the situation with freedom of speech in the West? Why is there not a drop of truth in almost everything they say about the situation in Ukraine?
Okay, freedom of speech in the West is pretty much dead, actually. It's coming to the point where people will be severely punished, as people could and were punished in Nazi Germany, for example, or in the Soviet Union. It's pretty much over. Already we see some journalists, particularly one German girl who's been sentenced to 3 years in prison simply for reporting the truth from Donbass. She's not calling for some revolution or calling to overthrow the state. She's simply reporting Donbass. We've seen the same thing in Germany. It seems to be the worst country at the moment, with some doctors who were pointing out that actually wearing a mask all day is very bad for your health. You can do it for a long time. It can really affect you very seriously, far more than any flu is going to, and so on and so forth. Why is there not one drop of truth? You're completely right, specifically about Ukraine, because for the Western ruling elites, Ukraine is everything. It is the most amazing, as I said, the most unprecedented in human history, as far as I'm aware, all over the world, as a weapon to undermine Russia. If they lose it, their plan to dismember Russia is over, at least for 100 years, if not forever. For them, nothing is more important. I came to understand over these last 8 years that the only thing that gets the Western ruling elites, those we see and those we don't really know about, out of bed in the morning is their rabid desire to dismember Russia and above all to finish her as the center of world Christianity. Therefore, nothing is more important for them than achieving that. So if some journalist wants occasionally to make an objective report about North Korea or Venezuela or Iran, well, okay, as long as it's not too often. But about Ukraine, about Russia, no. We're now locked in a battle, existential battle for survival. Of course, we call it a special operation. The West is going, why didn't you call it a war? Well, when the West started it, they called it not a war, they called it an anti-terrorist operation. When they first attacked Donbass, that was the name the West gave this operation to attack. So people sitting at home, minding their own business, who didn't go to the west of Ukraine and force them to speak Russian or force them to read Soviet literature or Russian literature or anything, just minding their own business, suddenly became terrorists. So the reality is this is, of course, World War III. World War III actually started in 2014. Now the next phase has started since February this year. And it's an existential struggle between, really and truly, between the Christian world and the Luciferian world of Western ruling elites. And if they win, we're going into total blackness and and depopulation, massive depopulation everywhere. They've written it. It's all completely open. We know what Bill Gates wants, what Soros wants, what they all want.
Do you know that there is not a single journalist from major European and American mass media on the territory of special military operation? And does this violate the basic principles of journalistic ethics?
Well, of course, because I'm sure they have been invited. I'm sure they have. I don't know that, but I'm absolutely sure they have been invited. If they went there, they would be looked after. They would have some bodyguards and so on. So they can say we're afraid to be on the enemy side. Of course, it violates. But as I just said, this is the West is not interested in facts.
Do you know? You know, I've been talking to some journalists from the West, and they told me actually that they've been told that do not go to that territory. Russia doesn't allow any journalists over there. Whoever goes there, Russia will shoot you. So they get lied and to be prevented from going and actually, making any news out of it. So the reality, personally, to me, I'm speaking personally for myself right now, seems like people just don't know exactly what's going on. They don't see it with their own eyes. They don't get it to film it. So basically, how they get the news, they make a phone call and somebody tells them what to write. But this is not an independent news. This is not both sides of the story, at least, you know. Now we have only one Western side, and then the Russian side that gets blocked from all over the rest of the world. I mean, like the Western side of the world.
Well, this is nothing new. It's just a little bit more extreme now. Even if these journalists went there, they would still probably lie, actually. Unless one of them had an awakening of conscience or something like this. The the Western world has always been ruled, as I thought, really for 1,000 years by these people, but there have been periods when it was not so bad. You know? I have to ask myself, as one who is no longer so young, you know, to live quite a few decades, my change of mind, is it because I've grown and learned more and I'm wiser now, or is it because the world has changed? And if I try to look at this objectively, I think it's both.
It is both.
Great Britain was a freer country 30, 40, 50 years ago. We did have a much wider debate about all sorts of issues on television. I remember it as a teenager. I mean, in the 1980s, there were all sorts of programs on television about all sorts of things. Now there are not, you know, and there's a whole load of people who are just blocked from, and they're not all obviously people telling the truth about Donbass or so are going to get blocked, yeah? Or called Putin stooges in the pay of the FSB, or all this kind of stuff that you get all the time. Warmongers. That's the other thing I get from people that are trolling me, ex-friends and so on who are pro-Western. Oh, you love the war. You became a warmonger. You're happy people are being killed. I'm not happy about it at all. No one in this country is happy about it. Russians hate war. No one is happy here. There is no jingoism here. I haven't seen one element from anybody, even when I've drunk people on the streets, I could say corresponds to an attitude of jingoism or kind of hooray patriotism or something like this. A few people have made some cheesy pop songs about, you know, patriotic, well, that I personally don't like, but apart from that, not, you know.
In your opinion, when will ordinary Americans faced with rising food and gasoline prices find it necessary to stop interfering in the international affairs of Ukraine, which they cannot even find on the map?
Yeah, of course, Nira. Unfortunately, I don't think ordinary Americans don't have any choice. There has been, I'm not an expert.
Welcome to the democracy.
Yeah, exactly. I spent 3 weeks in New York 10 years ago. I was actually thinking of moving there at the time because as a musician, there are some specialities about working in Russia and so on. Now, thank God I didn't make that choice. Thank God I didn't make that choice and start moving to America and trying to get a green card. It would have been a disaster in view of what happened just literally a few years later. Americans don't have much choice. I know there has always been a rump of the Americans I kind of respect, although I don't really know them actually. These people who live in kind of middle America, they like the Second Amendment here, they like their guns, and they're not going to give them up. They probably vote Republican, but they want America out of the rest of the world. They don't want their army interfering in the Middle East and in Russia and Ukraine and in China and Philippines and what have you. But those people just don't have any choice because even the Republican Party is run by those who are these globalist ruling elites, and the Democrat Party 100%. So voting in America is a vote for war, and anyone who goes against it just will not get in. And we've seen, you know, we all saw basically the election result in the United States was fake. I think the ruling elites after 2016 they got two inconvenient but not catastrophic shocks: election of Trump and Brexit, both of which they didn't want, but neither of which overturned their plans completely. So, but after that, they said elections are finished, we will control everything via electronic balloting and so on and so forth. The Americans have no choice about it. At least Americans do have guns, so they're better off than Australians, Canadians, or Brits that really can't do anything.
That's the dangerous part, when somebody doesn't have a choice and they have guns.
Yeah.
It can turn out as a disaster one day.
Maybe. Yeah.
Why has practically no one from the political and military leadership of the United States and NATO been brought to criminal responsibility for crimes that they committed in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on? Do such crimes have statute of limitations?
I don't really know about that. But basically, they run the world, so they're not going to put themselves on trial. That's it.
Logically, why sue yourself?
look at this obscene paradox with something. In Europe, there's a court of human rights. Now, Europe has been enslaving, destroying, massacring the world for 1,000 years, as I just said, but somehow we're all supposed to believe that Europe is the place where human rights can be put on trial. You saw what they did to Milosevic, yeah?
Yeah.
They killed him, basically,
Yes.
in The Hague and so on and so forth. So it's really a very, very major breakthrough, I think, for the whole world, that there will now be human rights trials and people will be put on trial in Mariupol. Mm-hmm. This is very symbolic that we move away from this idea, and all these Western bodies, you know, all these human rights bodies, these NGOs like Amnesty International and so on, they're basically agents of Western imperialism, all of them. There might still be some people there who are genuine here and there, but even the charities and it's all Western stuff, and it's all an agency of Western imperialism and control of African resources, Asian resources, South and Latin American resources, and so on and so on and so on.
Weapons supplied by Washington and a number of European states are used by Ukrainian nationalists to exterminate civilians and destroy the civilian infrastructure of Donbas. Mm-hmm. Does this mean that the leaders of Western countries support nationalism?
Yes, as long as that nationalism serves their interest, which is destroying Russia. Yeah, they wouldn't support it if it didn't. If it meant the breakup of Great Britain or something, or the breaking up of France because of nationalism between Breton people and French or something like this, then they wouldn't support it. They would support anything that means the breakup and destruction of the Russian world, or 1,000-year-old Russian civilization. As they supported, tacitly, of course, Bolshevism. They put the Bolsheviks in power in Russia and used it to destroy Russian history.
For 8 years now, the civilian population of the LDPR has been targeted almost daily by the Kiev regime. But during all this time, not a single human rights organization or court has accepted a complaint from the residents of Donbas. Why does the protection of rights and where politics begins?
Well, it ends where the ruling elites want it to end. You know, they're running the show, and they want Donbass for themselves. And from Donbass, they want to move on in southern Russia. And so these people are Russian people with Russian culture, Russian religion. They want to get rid of them. That's it. That's why.
There is an opinion that the Ukrainian authorities are deliberately prolonging the conflict with Russia, since every day of the special military operation allows Kiev to receive as many handouts from the West as possible. What do you think about this?
Okay, Mira, I'm not sure about this, actually. I don't see how Kiev itself can prolong the conflict. Russia has decided to proceed with this conflict in a certain way, which is not the way the West was expecting. The West was expecting them to advance deep into and overfly all these foundations and trenches and fortifications they've carefully built with NATO's on over the last 8 years. And then they were planning, then we'll have the uprising from within, there'll be partisans. So Russia decided to go very slowly. This is controversial. A lot of my patriotic Russian friends and so on are saying, why is it so slow? We still don't really understand. Our leadership isn't explaining, blah, blah, blah. So this is causing some problems here. It's the Western elites, the USA, Great Britain above all, and the bosses of the European Union, who of course want to prolong this conflict as long as possible and make it as difficult for Russia as possible, and of course win. Only the other day, last week, we had Boris Johnson saying, we're going to total victory. Every inch of Ukraine will be, including Crimea, of course, will be returned to Ukrainian territory and so on and so forth. I actually think that certainly for the period since the operation started, 4th of February, that the slowness of the operation plays more into Russia's hands than it does into the West's hands, actually. Because we see that the Western leaders, and above all the Western public, are getting tired of the non-stop propaganda. They've seen these nationalist Ukrainian people full of entitlement coming to their countries as refugees and not behaving as one would expect. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is looking at Russia-Ukraine conflict. The rest of the world understands that it's the West started this conflict in 2014, if not before. But a lot of the West, a lot of other countries in Latin America, Africa, have rather positive memories, actually, of the later years of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was a very good partner for them and not really very oppressive and so on. Many people from Latin America, from Africa, came to study in the Soviet Union in those days, from India, of course. So the rest of the world is now looking at this, and the longer it goes on, the more people are waking up to the truth. More people, even in Western countries, are seeing through this wall of unprecedented propaganda. So I think actually, I'm not sure that Kiev can prolong or shorten this conflict by itself, because it doesn't have this power. Only the United States, Britain, and the other.
I know what you mean, yeah. Do you think the special military operation of Russia means the collapse for the Western hegemony? And what scenarios of the new world order would you highlight?
So yes, I do think this operation is historical. It absolutely means this, which is why the West is determined not to let it succeed. As I said, this is an existential struggle now, and hence it is World War III. Russia cannot lose this conflict. If Russia loses this conflict, Russia is finished. That's it. It cannot lose. And at the same time, if Russia succeeds in these terms, even just within the boundaries of Ukraine, the West's rule over the Western hegemony is finished. Yeah, it's absolutely finished. And the rest of the world will not take any notice of the West anymore. And probably they'll lose their financial control too, which is already happening before our eyes. But this is very, very dangerous because it is World War III. It's a totally existential struggle for power over this world. And it's very interesting, actually, that this fake entity of Ukraine on both sides has played such a vital role, because these nationalists, these Galicians, and then others who became infected with this "we are the master race" kind of superiority, it's them who have brought the world to the edge of World War III, nuclear holocaust maybe, which we know this can happen at any minute. They did it, not Croatian nationalists or Bosnian nationalists or even German nationalists in the modern day or any other. Only they did it. And the people of Donbass are the ones who stopped the Western juggernaut dead. With help from Russia, of course. We all understand that there was massive help from Russia in 2014 when they decided to set up the republics to be independent from Ukraine and so on. So it stopped there. This world, it's absolutely true what many people have said, including Russell Bentley has said on many occasions, that the way Donbass goes is the way the world goes. If Donbass loses, it means Russia loses, and we go to this great reset, the Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab dream, or we go to a multipolar world of sovereign countries again, where culture can exist in its own right.
Not that long ago, I had an interview with someone, and he told me that Donbass is defending Russia right now because Donbass is taking the main hit.
Yes.
Can you please tell me?
That's a good point.
It is. Can you please tell me when and how the special military operation of Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine will end, and will it be possible to carry out the complete denazification of Ukraine, and which areas will come under the control of Russia?
Oh, that's a very complicated question, which I do not pretend to have certain answers to. I can make
You
an
can
informed,
only
I can
your
make an
perspective.
informed guess. Yes. Many people are discussing this, that, and the other. My personal gut feeling is that no matter how difficult it is, this must go all the way. When the operation to save Crimea from the new junta got underway, I didn't know the deeper history of Crimea. I understood instinctively. I follow my intuition, luckily, on this. But this was not just a question of geopolitics or something. There was something deeply spiritual and deeply spiritually important for Russia in this. Only later, in the years to come, would I understand that, yes, Russia first became a Christian country in 988, when the great Prince Vladimir chose Christianity and had himself baptized in what is now Sevastopol. Now, many people are going to say, yeah, that's some old history and nobody really cares about it. No, it's not. A, time is an illusion. B, these Western ruling elites, they might tell us at school and in our education systems that all that stuff's not important. For them, it's vitally important. I'm absolutely convinced it is that spiritual connection of the baptism of Russia into Christian orthodoxy in Crimea that they wanted to destroy, to cut, and to keep away from, because the Western elites have been obsessed with Crimea for something like 200 or 300 years.
This is an interesting idea. I never thought about it.
Second, we go to Kiev. Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalists try to say that because of that, that means that Russia is actually Ukraine and Kiev should be the capital of massive Ukraine all over. This is complete roundabout thinking. The second great baptism of Russia was under Vladimir Monomakh in Kiev. So Kiev has massive spiritual importance, and due to their religion, and this Ronald Bernard says, I'm telling you, 95% of the real rulers of the Western world follow this religion. They are absolutely determined to stop that happening. I think, far be it from me to say what God wants, because I'm not a trained priest or anything like that. I'm a Russian Orthodox person. God wants Kiev back. I'm absolutely sure that to leave some rump of some kind of Ukrainian nationalist government speaking this fake Ukrainian language in Kiev cannot actually be. This conflict is a very, very serious war already, with very serious loss of life, and on the Russian side too. It's much worse on the Ukrainian side, but unfortunately, as many have said, those Ukrainians are actually Russians for the most part, except the Galicians, who were never in the Russian Empire, had no hereditary memory, and were only included into the Ukrainian USSR by Stalin twice in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and again after the Second World War, which meant he did it on purpose in order to weaken Russia, actually. It seems 2 years later, at the winter of 46 into 47, Stalin changed and split with the West. The Bolsheviks were working with the West for the first 20 years of the Soviet Union and throughout the Second World War. But something happened. Exactly what is a very interesting and long topic. And there was a genuine split. With Stalin, he split with the West in 46. But after the Second World War, it was totally planned that the Soviet army would remain in Eastern Europe and that communism would be imposed. Some of these Freemasons even wrote about it in the middle of the 19th century, that this plan would be. And of course, Marx and Engels were promoted by this Western financial ruling elites too. So at the beginning of your point was again, when we talk about denazification in Ukraine, it does mean the fact that many of these people love, they worship, they are nostalgic for the Third Reich. Their main historical regret is that the Third Reich did not win the Second World War, and they tattoo Nazi symbols of the Third Reich on their bodies and use flags and so on and so forth. That has to be eradicated, of course. But what we're really talking about on a deeper level here is this Western idea of nearly 1,000 years that Western people have the right to go to the rest of the world, exploit them, and force their educational ideas, their way of life on everybody else, and to destroy other ways of life and other forms of government and so on that had existed in Africa, in Latin America, in North America, in Asia, and that's what we've done. And in the 20th century, actually, the Western imperialist tool of Marxism was super successful for the Western elites. It gave them the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire that they had not managed to capture in the same way as they captured North America, South America, Africa, India,